Hi, I'm Paul Edwards. I'm a self-published horror author, and first and foremost, a monster kid. Last night I watched Final Destination: Bloodlines from 2025, the sixth and most recent installment in the Final Destination franchise. If you're not familiar with this franchise, the basic premise is that death is a force of nature, and death has a pattern that it tries to follow of who is going to die and when they are going to die. And death's pattern could be called death's design. It's called death's design by some of the characters. And every now and then, a human being is able to sort of see behind the curtain of the workings of the universe and see death's design and foresee certain deaths before they actually can happen. And a person who has this foresight can temporarily thwart death's design by avoiding the circumstance that would lead for the person to get killed. So this tends to happen in situations where there's a mass fatality. In the first Final Destination, there was a plane disaster, an airplane disaster. In the second Final Destination, it was a highway pileup. In the third Final Destination, there was a roller coaster disaster. The fourth Final Destination took place at a stock car race where a whole bunch of spectators were killed in the audience. The fifth Final Destination was the collapse of one of those big suspension bridges. And this Final Destination, the disaster takes place in one of those elevated restaurants up on a tower where you can see a view of the whole surrounding area. So in each case, one person is able to see death's design, which they're really not supposed to see, and temporarily either prevent the disaster or at least prevent a whole bunch of people from being killed in the disaster. And then what happens throughout the course of the movie is that the force of death has to correct the imbalance in the universe by hunting down, in effect, each person who survived and killing them off in the order in which they should have died according to death's design. One important fact in this franchise is that death is not a supernatural force. There's nothing supernatural that's supposed to be happening in these Final Destination films. It's not the devil. It's not the Grim Reaper. It's not a supernatural evil. In fact, it's exactly the opposite of that. The whole point of the Final Destination premise is that death is a force of nature. It's an operation of the natural world, not the supernatural world. And death is a force that can't be reasoned with because it operates in the same way as any other force of nature. You can be temporarily fought and forestalled, but not for long. So the original Final Destination film actually was written to be an episode of The X-Files. And if you'll notice, in the original Final Destination film, there's two FBI agents, a skeptical FBI agent and an FBI agent who's open to extreme possibilities. And these characters originally were written to be Mulder and Scully in The X-Files. And what happened as the episode was being written was that people realized, hey, this is a good enough quality story that it could be its own feature film. So that's where the franchise began. Now, in the first Final Destination, we were dealing with a group of high school students. Pretty low-hanging fruit for a horror movie. In the second Final Destination, they tried to get away from it being a teen-oriented production. And so they had more people from varying age groups and varying walks of life. It didn't really work that well. So in the third film, they went right back to using a whole bunch of teenagers again. And since then, there's been at least a steady supply of teenagers and young adults, but not exclusively. There were also older adults who are targeted by death in these productions. Now, this film brings a completely new angle to the Final Destination mythos, and I really like the new angle that they brought here. In every previous Final Destination, there's been a mass disaster that happened or should have happened, and then within the next few days or weeks, death hunts down the people that were involved who should have died and causes them to die. In this film, though, the disaster was huge. There were a whole ton of people that should have died according to death's design who didn't die because one person was able to warn everybody because they foresaw it. Because there were so many survivors that death had to hunt down and get, it took a long time for death to work its way through them all. This disaster happened in 1969. And because it happened so long ago, and generations have passed, people who survived that disaster, who shouldn't have gone on to have their own children, and those children have had time to grow up and have their own children, and so forth. And under death's design, all of these people never should have existed because their father or grandfather or mother or grandmother should have been killed back in 1969. So it has taken death a long time to not only kill off all those survivors, but also their descendants who never should have existed. And finally, death has now, after all these years, death has worked its way up to this set of characters that we're dealing with, the descendants of the woman who foresaw the disaster in the restaurant all those years ago. And of course, there's been plenty of time to go by. That woman had children, and those children grew up and had their own children, one of whom is the main character who now is dealing with the force of death. Death now has to hunt down each of her family members in order of their age, because that's the order in which the person came into existence that shouldn't have existed. And the way that death hunts the people down is one of the features of this franchise. They never use the actual phrase Rube-Goldberg, but that's what it is. Death uses a Rube-Goldberg approach to killing off people. Remember, this is not the kind of horror movie where there's something that you can fight physically. There's no psycho killer, there's no monster, there's no demon. It's nothing that has any sort of a body to it. It's a force. So the way that death hunts people is by causing freak accidents. And as the franchise has gone on, the accidents have become even more and more improbable, although never impossible. They're always things that technically could happen. They're just very unlikely. And the phrase Rube Goldberg comes from a cartoonist who lived about 100 years ago. And his cartoons would draw, they would depict people who invented crazily elaborate machines to perform simple tasks. I usually think of a Rube Goldberg machine as being something that Wile E. Coyote used in his cartoons. In his own little lair, he would have a Rube Goldberg machine where, he would just press one button and, all kinds of elaborate things would happen. You press a button and a toaster turns on and the piece of toast pops up and it hits a string, and the string pulls on a bottle so that the bottle tips over and the fluid from the bottle falls onto the next thing, and the next piece moves and the next piece. Even if you've never heard the term Rube Goldberg, I'm sure you know exactly what kind of thing I'm talking about. If you were a child of anywhere near my era, you might remember the board game Mousetrap. Mousetrap was a Rube Goldberg machine. So death uses Rube Goldberg machines and takes advantage of whatever items are around the targeted person whenever it's time to kill them. Sometimes death can be thwarted a second time with the Rube Goldberg machine being thwarted, but then death still is not given up on the person and will try again. One feature of the Final Destination films that keeps them probably from becoming a little more popular than they probably should be is that they are quite gory. I mean, this is an R-rated horror franchise for a reason. It's absolutely not family friendly. But there are some movies that are rated R because maybe there's some bad language or a little bit of violence that's a little too much. I'm not talking about violence, I'm talking about gore specifically. There's a whole lot of gore in the Final Destination franchise that probably pleases gore hounds, but also probably keeps them from becoming a little bit more of a mainstream success that they probably could have been. I mean, there are other R-rated horror franchises that are more generally accepted by the public. So, you know, I'm not saying that's bad, just that's something to be aware of if you're considering watching the films. This Final Destination, Bloodlines, I think almost certainly is the best Final Destination film they've ever put out. That's saying a lot because there was a lot to like in especially the earlier Final Destinations. But this film is so clever that even non-horror fans, like my wife, have thought that it's a good film. So that's saying a lot. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Tony Todd. Tony Todd, a well-known horror actor, made his final film appearance in this movie. In fact, by the time the movie had actually come out, he had already died. Tony Todd was in the first Final Destination and has been in the series as it's gone on as a man who has special insight into how death's design works. And he offers advice and tips and exposition as needed whenever each group of characters seeks him out during one of these movies. In this film, we finally get to learn the backstory of exactly how it is that he has any special knowledge about death's design and what's going on. And he has a couple of lines of dialogue in the film that make it clear to even people that aren't as familiar with the franchise, they make it clear that the actor knew that this was going to be it, I think. It's sad when you know that he was ill and was going to die, and he knew he was ill and was going to die when he filmed these scenes. And, you know, kudos to him for wanting to finish off his career with one last performance in this role, because it was really good, very good. So, rest in peace, Tony Todd. And the Final Destination franchise, though, will live on. Yes, of course, they're already talking about a sequel to this film. So I'm sure we are not done with Final Destination. Listen, if you enjoy vintage horror and 20th century horror films, you should check out my book series, the Mourner's Woods books. I'm a self-published author. I self-publish on Amazon. I've written a series of novels that take place in a haunted forest, and each book is a standalone story with a completely new cast of characters entering into this haunted wilderness where they face a different supernatural threat in each book. My name again is Paul Edwards. My books are the Mourner's Woods books. I post a link in the description on this video. Thanks for letting me talk to you about Final Destination, Bloodlines. I'll see you in Mourner's Woods.